So today we are doing another CodingBat problem called tripleUp. So we want to return true if the array contains somewhere three increasing adjacent numbers like 4, 5, 6, or 23, 24, 25. So this is an interesting one. So we obviously want to look into each element in the for loop, and we want to say, okay, if we want to look at each element, then we're more than likely going to have a for loop here, right? To actually traverse the array and look at the elements to judge whether at any given element are the next two consecutive increments. And what I mean by that is, if we have a 1 here, is the next element 1 plus that element, and is the next element after that 1 plus the element which came before. So if you think about it, let's do this with 4 numbers here. So this is our array. This is our array, and inside this array we have elements, and of course each of these elements has a corresponding index with which we can actually reference these elements. So if we had a case where we actually do have 3 increasing numbers, such as 3, 4, and 3, 4, and 5, these are of course 3 increasing adjacent numbers. And I guess the last one could be any arbitrary number. We just need to return true if there is in fact 3 increasing numbers. In this case, there are 3 increasing numbers. So we'll go inside here, it'll say, okay, well, if we're looking at nums of I, okay, and if nums of I plus 1, okay, so what does that mean? So nums of I is 0 in this case. And so this is essentially saying, okay, this resolves to 3 because we're looking at nums of 0, and at nums of 0 we have 3. And so is nums of I plus 1? Well, actually, this may not be a right approach. Is nums of I plus 1 equal to nums of I plus 1? In other words, so we're looking at, so if I say nums of I and then I have a plus 1, that's taking what nums of I is, which is 3, and adding 1 to it. But if I have nums of I plus 1, as in the plus is inside the brackets, then I'm actually taking the index and I'm incrementing it by 1. So I'm actually looking at another element now. So if I say nums of I plus 1, that means I'm looking at nums of I, but nums of I plus 1, in other words, actually the index is being incremented. So I'm actually looking at another element. So if I say nums of I plus 1, I'm saying, okay, does this element, now I'm looking at this element, does this element equal what nums of I was, which was 0, plus 1? In other words, does nums of I plus 1, in other words, the element next to nums of I, equal nums of I plus 1, which is 4. So does nums of I plus 1 equal to nums of I plus 1? Of course. Nums of I is 0, which is referencing 3, and nums of I plus 1 is 1, which is referencing 4. And does nums of I plus 1, which is coming outside the bracket, does that in fact equal nums of I? Well, for this one, yes, it does, right? So nums of I plus 1 does in fact equal nums of I plus 1. In this case, we would want to return true. However, we actually want to check the element which comes right after so we want to check 3, right? So if we're on any given iteration, we actually want to be able to check the next 2 elements which come after that. And since we're referencing an element which is essentially, since we're actually incrementing the index, we actually have to take into account what if we are at the edge of the array, in which case we will just simply say, okay, I must be less than nums.length minus 1. So this takes into account that we don't actually walk off the edge of the array, so we won't have out of bounds index errors. And I'll actually show you without this what outcome we'll get. But so if nums of I plus 1 is equal to nums of I plus 1, in other words, if nums of I plus 1, which is incrementing the index, is the next index equal to the previous number plus 1, in this case it is, we'll return true. But of course we actually want to look at the next two numbers after nums of I. So we're actually going to say, okay, if nums of I plus 1 is equal to nums of I plus 1, then we'll also check if nums of I plus 2, which is of course now looking at nums of I plus 2 indexes, we're now looking at the third element referenced by the second index. Does nums of I plus 2 equal to nums of I plus 2? And of course, if it is, we'll return true. Okay. And if it's not, I mean, if this is just not the case, then we'll just return false. And we actually have to specify that. And since we're incrementing by 2 in total, we actually want to take into account if we're at the edge of the array, incrementing by 2 would actually walk us off the edge of the array. And so we would get an out of bounds error, index out of bounds error. And we'll take into account we'll mitigate that by only iterating until the last one before the last two elements in the array. And then if we return this, you'll see we get all greens. But if we didn't have this -2 here, we would get array index out of bounds errors. So this -2 really offsets. If you're ever referencing a certain amount of elements, you want to make sure that you also offset by those amounts of elements in the for loop parameter. So yeah, I mean, so we could have done this if I were to say, okay, we could have done this. We could have made a Boolean called contains and set that to false. And I could say, okay, if this is the case, if we do in fact have 3 adjacent numbers, we'll set contains to true, and then we won't have to set it to false outside, because false is the default value. And we could just return contains, and you'll see that cannot find symbol contains. That's interesting. So one is contains and one is contained. So yeah, that also works. That also works.